Welcome to Asia Unlocked, where we cover current events and emerging trends in Asia. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Asia Unlocked. Today I'm joined by Alan Tidwell, who will talk to us about U.S. policy toward the Pacific and the politics of smaller states. Alan Tidwell is a professor of the practice and director for the Center for Australian, New Zealand, and Pacific Studies at Georgetown University. Thank you for joining us, Alan.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
I'd like to start by asking you to provide some context on the Pacific Island countries, or PICS, for listeners. How would you describe the PICS and what makes them an important point of the conversation for those interested in international relations, U.S. foreign policy, and the Pacific?
Sure. So there are 14 Pacific Island countries. They range in size from a population as small as 1,200 to a population notionally as large as perhaps 15 million. The upper end we're not quite sure of, but that's a reasonable guesstimate. They are distributed across the Pacific Ocean. They none of them share contiguous borders. The only country in the Pacific Island states that has a land border is Papua New Guinea, which borders Indonesia. So they're all surrounded by water. They also have enormous internal distances separating them by water. So that, for instance, if you think about the country of the Federated States of Micronesia, it is a country that from island to island fits within the continental United States just barely. It is tremendous distribution from island to island. So very small states, distributed populations that sit astride some of the most busy international shipping lanes across the globe. So really important places, fascinating challenges of governance. They're all democracies and functioning democracies that really don't have many of the challenges that you might find amongst some democratic states that are at risk of backsliding. I don't think there's concern about backsliding in the Pacific.
You talked about the geography of the region. You mentioned that
Mm.
most of them are surrounded completely by water. And I think that's interesting because when we have conversations about China, US China competition, and security in the region, geography is extremely important because of the maritime nature of the Indo-Pacific. That maritime domain is extremely important, and that influences the policy sort of priorities of the U.S. and China. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about how geography might play a role in influencing the political priorities of the PICS. Does it have an influence, and if so, what kind of influence does it have?
Well, I suppose geography is important for the PICS in as much that they are, while they sit astride shipping lanes, they are not destinations for shipping lanes. So geography is important because ships go past, they don't often stop. And so the price of goods, the price of importing and exporting items is large. And without large land mass, it does limit their economic capacity. At the same time, sitting where they do in the Pacific Ocean, as the United States and the PRC look across the Pacific at one another, they look across the, if you will, the porches and the harbors of Pacific Island countries. And those Pacific Island countries are destinations along the way. Both the United States and the PRC, as well as Australia and New Zealand and Japan, have an interest in ensuring the free access to the Pacific Islands for themselves. The United States, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand have all put their hand up for freedom of navigation, a free and open Indo-Pacific. So there is an interest in that geography, in looking both east and west at economic opportunity, but also looking warily east and west, being concerned that as two large powers might vie with one another for influence, that the Pacific Island states themselves might indeed become battlegrounds or at least points of contestation between the United States and the PRC.
And can you talk a bit more about some of the aspects or some of the features of the islands that might make them so important for competition? So, for example, some people have written about the creation of infrastructure on those islands that have dual use capabilities.
Sure. I mean, Pacific Island countries all have airfields. Airfields welcome airplanes. And one of the things that those Pacific Island countries may depend upon is tourism. Tourism comes on the back of the wings of a 777 or a 767 or an Airbus plane, which have large landing fields. And those landing fields are great for bringing tourists in, but they can also be dual used for the importation of military hardware, for the arrival of soldiers from distant places. This is the same concern that the United States expressed in the 1980s over the island of Grenada. And you'll remember that when the Grenadans were building a 10,000-foot long runway, that the Reagan administration became so concerned that that was one of their rationale points for actually seeking to intervene in Grenada. And so we look to the islands of the Pacific and we see the infrastructure that gets constructed, whether it's modern ports or airfields, and we begin to think about those places not merely as civilian infrastructure, but the kind of infrastructure that could be exploited by militaries with other alternative visions of the future.
I want to turn to talking about the different parties that are interested in interacting or engaging with the PICS. So let's start with the US. A piece you recently co authored for Foreign Policy argues that there's a misalignment in terms of US interests and PICS interests, with the US emphasizing security and competition with China, whereas PICS emphasize issues like human security, economic development, infrastructure development, etc. I'm wondering, because it's very clear that the US understands the importance of the PICS. Why do you think, despite recognizing the importance of the PICS, the US has been so slow to adapt and adopt a strategy that would better suit the interests of leaders in the PICS?
That's a really interesting question, and I kind of grapple with that myself a little bit, Eric. I think part of it is that there is a political and ideological component to the United States in engaging with Pacific Island countries, not understanding the nature of very small Pacific Island state governments and the kind of challenges that they experience. That's one. The Trump administration, Trump 2.0, came in, and you recall Doge very quickly began to make cuts within the State Department and with USAID. Both of those cuts diminished the American capacity to engage with the Pacific Island countries. I don't think the Doge had the Pacific in mind at all. I don't know that they had any sensibility about them when it came to strategic competition. And so one of the consequences of that has been a sort of an own goal, if you will, and that own goal is to really eradicate some of the very fundamental components of American engagement with the Pacific. I mean, this is collateral damage. This is collateral damage in the Pacific in the face of an early Trump administration that was, I think, intently focused on a range of other issues. Um, but yeah, it's created some real difficulties for the United States, and it's been doubled that difficulty getting rid of USAID, but it's been doubled too by some of the deportations and some of the travel bans that have been implemented. There is a rationale that you can create around some of this stuff, but you have to do a little bit of what if kind of reasoning. One of the challenges I have as a researcher is actually finding interlocutors from the State Department who will talk publicly. In previous administrations, and including Trump 1.0, there was a willingness to engage with stakeholders, academics, and think tanks. Today, that is really limited, and it has constrained our ability to try to peek inside to see what's happening. So, if you don't mind, I just want to rabbit on for a second because one of the things that has happened had been the travel bans that have been implemented, and the travel bans have, for the most part, skirted over the top of the Pacific Island countries and their first articulation. One country has been specifically called out on the partial travel ban. And the distinction between a partial travel ban and a travel ban is really very thin. There's not a lot of difference. So let's just call it a travel ban and be done with it. And that's Tonga. So Tonga is on the travel ban, and the rationale behind Tonga being on the travel ban was the overstay rate for visitors from Tonga. There is a diaspora here in the United States of Tongans. I believe it numbers, I want to say around 50,000 or thereabouts, mostly in the West Coast. Tongans travel back and forth between Tonga and the United States. People come for weddings, they come for funerals, they come for family events. There has been an overstay rate of around 6.9% or thereabouts. It's a tiny number of people. But nonetheless, that earned the ire of those who were planning a travel ban, and so the travel ban was put in place against Tonga. And you might wonder, well, why? I mean, that makes no sense. Um, and for me, I had two different explanations. One was just that it was the error rate of the Trump administration's travel ban process. It's political, it's chaotic. That would be one explanation, and I don't not allergic to that explanation. The other explanation is actually that it was to send a signal to Tonga in the midst of Tonga's exposure to debt trap diplomacy by the Chinese. And it was an attempt to try to steer the Tongans away from the PRC because, of course, travel bans can be put in place and they can be withdrawn. And they're in place. And Tonga just recently announced that it will no longer take Chinese loans. Now we're at a testing moment. Will the Trump administration walk back the travel ban as credit for Tonga being willing to forego future Chinese loans? And that's the test of the thesis. If the Trump administration walks it back, then it was a punishment meted out by the Trump administration and it had logic and rationale behind it. If they don't walk it back, then you can only say that it was Trump administration chaos and the politicization of that whole process.
I want to ask a quick follow-up. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about how Pacific Islands, you talked about with the example of Tonga, they'll no longer take Chinese loans. So in this case, U.S. pressure did work. And I know we've talked in the past before, the U.S. is not new to using pressure in order to get the PICS to do what they want. For example, I remember back in the day, I think there was a deal with one of the PICS in China, and it upset the U.S. so much an official flew over to speak with the officials, local officials. I'm wondering, did they continue to use pressure in order to get concessions from the PICS because it works? And what do the PICS think? Are the PICS changing their strategy? Is it pushing them closer toward China? Is it pushing them closer toward some other party? What are the PICS doing in response, or what are they thinking?
So the comment that we're talking, the case you're talking about was the 2022 move by the Solomon Islands to sign a policing agreement with the PRC. And so the Solomon Islands had a policing agreement with Australia. That was their primary security guarantor, if you will. And in 2022, an alternative agreement was signed with the PRC by the leadership in Honiara. As the news of that agreement leaked prematurely, the agreement has never been published, by the way, but the text of the draft text of the agreement was leaked prematurely. And it led forces from the United States, the Assistant Secretary of State, as well as the Director for Indo-Pacific Security from the NSC to fly to Honiara to put pressure on Solomon Islands to denounce the agreement. It did not work. It failed miserably. I would argue, in fact, it failed so badly that Solomon Islands, that had been wanting to cooperate with the United States and welcome Peace Corps volunteers to Solomon Islands, they themselves punished the United States for their treatment at the demands of those officials by effectively canceling the Peace Corps program in Solomon Islands. And the bilateral relationship between Solomon Islands and the United States is rocky and is kind of stymied at this point. There is no shipwriter agreement, that is a policing agreement with the Coast Guard in Solomon Islands. We still can't get the Peace Corps in, so it's a difficult relationship. So that pressure didn't work. And I would push back against the narrative that pressure often works. In fact, the Pacific Islands are pretty adept at countering pressure. One, the United States can't be too heavy-handed because it looks bad, right? These are places that are very, very subject to international pressure if you wanted to really hammer them. But I don't think governments really feel good about that. And I don't think it gets you very far, in part because there are enough suitors to the Pacific Islands that the Pacific Island countries themselves, I think, have been involved in what I would call strategic arbitrage. They have been busy peddling themselves and not in a tacky kind of way, but they've been willing to play parties off of one another in order to get better deals. And one of the really interesting things that's been happening in the recent couple of years has been a pushback by donor countries against that strategic arbitrage process. So the Australians have signed 3 agreements in the Pacific that have pushed back against that playing parties off against one another. Just very briefly, the Australia signed the Falapili Union with Tuvalu, signed an agreement with Nauru, and an alliance relationship with Papua New Guinea. And embedded in each one of those 3 agreements is a non-derogation clause that effectively says you agree not to sign a security treaty with another party without our consent, which effectively is trying to throw cold water on top of that strategic arbitrage of dampening down that playing parties off of one another. And so the United States comes in, and if the thesis is correct that the United States travel ban against Tonga is part and parcel of this process, that it would again dampen down that strategic arbitrage because effectively the United States is saying to Tonga, don't go looking to the Chinese for loans. New Zealand just announced this week the conclusion of a deal with the Cook Islands that ends a year-long dispute with the Cook Islands after Cook Islands signed a mineral and maritime agreement with the PRC. Wellington became so incensed that they withheld funding to Cook Islands, beg your pardon. And it looked like, things were really sort of heating up. And happily, New Zealand and Cook Islands have been able to sign an agreement and in which the Cook Islands say that they will give preference to New Zealand for all international security and defense matters. And again, this is an attempt, I think, to dampen down that strategic arbitrage. So we're kind of at a really interesting moment. It started in 2022 with a failure by the United States and by Australia to limit what Solomon Islands was doing, and I would argue that policing agreement with the PRC was the height of strategic arbitrage. And ever since that, Australia, the United States, New Zealand have been working to try to really limit that kind of bargaining process.
I was going to ask you about China next, but I feel like that's just too great an opportunity to segue into partners and allies. So I'm wondering, in certain conversations about the Indo-Pacific, sometimes when talking about the economic order, for example, people will talk about how U.S. withdrawal or U.S. absence from the region created a vacuum that enabled partners and allies to step up as regional leaders. Do you think that argument or that kind of line of analysis holds true when we look at inadequate engagement by the U.S. with PICS?
Um, well, I suppose that Australia has stepped up modestly. I mean, they've already been stepped up quite considerably. They have very deep engagement, but so they've been able to expand their spending modestly to fill the gap left by some U.S. programming. New Zealand has maintained their engagement across Polynesia, but we don't see other partners from the West engaging with Pacific Island countries in the way that we might like to see. The Brits seem to have actually perhaps put a freeze on any expansion they have there. The French have attempted to engage parties in New Caledonia, trying to seek a peace deal in New Caledonia, and it keeps bumping along and not going very well at the end of the day. We haven't seen Japan significantly increase its engagement. It does great work, but it hasn't really changed its footprint considerably. Um, so it's a little hard to see, that there really have been parties to step in and replace what the United States has taken away.
So for those countries who have already had modern engagement or have already been stepped up, like Australia, for example,
Mm.
what do you think are some of the national interests or political interests that are motivating them to pursue deep engagement with the PICS?
Australia's rationale for engagement today is very clear. It was articulated in the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper. It's been articulated in the National Defense Strategy, as well as the at least two defense white papers, and that is strategic denial. Australia has an interest in denying access um, to northern ports, northern points of access. And so it engages in strategic denial, but as a middle power, it can't engage in strategic denial in the same way that the United States can. The United States is a great power with a large navy and significant military capacity. And so when it engages in strategic denial, it can speak with a loud megaphone. Australia, much more difficult. And so that's what's so interesting about the agreements that Australia has just been signing, the three that I alluded to, is that they have looked for those non-derogation components of those agreements as a form of their strategic denial. This is middle power strategic denial, not something that's well covered in literature, but it is nonetheless an innovation that Australia has pursued. New Zealand has a similar kind of approach, but for the Cook Islands. Cook Islands are an integral part of New Zealand's realm. So the realm countries, those two that are in free association with New Zealand, Niue and Cook Islands, and the territory of Tokelau, they are keen to ensure that no one breaks up the realm. And I think the agreement that the PRC had signed with Cook Islands raised real concerns that there was an attempt to break up the realm by the PRC. And that really, I think, quite animated voices in Wellington. So, in both the Australian and New Zealand example, what they're really interested in is keeping forces out that might be there for nefarious purposes, but they each have to do it in terms of either middle power or small power. They can't do it through naval deployment. They can't do it through military basing. They have to look for an alternative pathway.
You mentioned some terms that I want to ask you to clarify for some of our listeners. So, when you were talking about the US and Australia, you made a distinction that one is a great power, whereas the other is a middle power. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us about what makes a middle power. Is it a question of military strength, economic size, or is there more to the equation?
Well, as I could talk a lot about that, so let me try to be very succinct. There are few agreed definitions of what a middle power is. They are not a power of hegemony. They are typically countries with small militaries, but capable, sometimes very capable militaries. So you think about Canada, Australia as two middle powers, classically identified as middle powers, capable militaries, but not large in size. The Australian military is what, about 40,000 people all up. It's a small navy, three destroyers, seven frigates, and patrol boats. So a pretty small capability, but effective. But middle powers can also be almost unarmed, and small states equally can be almost unarmed. There is no number that you can put against states in terms of how big they are to be middle powers. So we can simply say that middle powers are capable states living under, that is below the threshold of large great powers. And great powers are those that have the potential to be hegemons. And in that case, I put, there are three great powers in the world today, in my view. Uh, they are the United States, China, and Russia, and their potential for being hegemons is in part their size of population, their physical size, their possession of large nuclear weapon stocks, and in the case of the United States and China, very large dominant economies. One way to think about, defining a middle power is you kind of hear the phrase, and from there it's the vibe, and that's how I work with it.
So we've talked a bit already about what some of China's interests might be when it comes to motivating cooperation or engagement with the PICS. I'm wondering if you can talk to us a bit about what is public perception like when it comes to PICS engaging China. Is there a sentiment that Chinese investment on these islands is positive or great for the country? And the reason I ask is because with the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, there are some that argue that infrastructure investment and development on China's part is poor, it's shoddily done, and as a result, it hurts domestic perceptions of cooperation with China. Does that line of analysis hold true for the PICS, or would you say that things are more positive in the Pacific?
Well, I suppose you have to frame that question from a starting place. And if your starting place is we don't have a port and now we have a port, but the port's not very good, you still have a port. And so I do think that while the quality question is often recognized, it's put up against the comparator of would we have anything versus something that's subpar versus something that's great. And so, broadly speaking, I think that the Chinese investments are broadly deemed to be okay. I think they're taken for what they are. But if you go to a Chinese clinic and you meet a Chinese doctor and someone takes care of the wound on your leg versus not finding a doctor, then going to a Chinese doctor is great. And I think that's kind of full circle back to the question of the United States. So one of the places that the United States was looking to fill was trying to answer that question. If you need someone to fix the cut on your leg, you would have a choice between a Chinese doctor or an American trained, Australian trained, or other doctor, right? But the Trump administration has taken the decision that that choice isn't meaningful in the Pacific. I don't know if that's an informed step on their part or not, but that's the net effect of getting rid of USAID and getting rid of some of the development assistance that was going to the Pacific. And I think the rationale that the Biden administration and others have suggested is offering the Pacific a choice is absolutely essential. Um, and right now, that choice isn't really on offer. It's not to say that the United States isn't doing anything, and it would be wrong to say that the United States is doing nothing. It's just that what the United States is doing right now in terms of the Millennium Challenge Corporation or the Trade Development Administration or these other programs are much longer in timeline to roll out and aren't developing lots of boots on the ground or people on the ground. And one of the great things I used to think about USAID and American contractors going to the Pacific is that Pacific Islanders got to talk to Americans and got to hear about, what people cared about. And I think that's really important. And that's missing now. It's really hard to find.
One last follow-up question for you, with regard to the idea that the U.S. should emphasize providing choices for those in the Pacific. I'm wondering, do you think that it's important for the US to provide options in all areas? So if China provides options for medicine, the US also provides options for medicine. If it provides options for infrastructure development, the US also provides options for infrastructure development. Do you think that sort of tit for tat approach is what the US should do? Or do you think that there are specific areas or issues that the US should prioritize providing assistance in?
Yeah, look, I think we have to pick and choose. I mean, it would be absurd to, on the education front, to compete tit for tat with China because China can pick up large swaths of students and plop them down in Chinese tertiary education institutions. I want more Pacific Islanders to come to the United States. I want them to come. I want them to come to Georgetown. But one of the problems we have in the United States is cost. And the price point for Chinese higher education is so much lower that I kind of think, well, there's no reason to compete on volume in with the Chinese on that. We can compete on quality, but I don't think we can do it in volume. So we should walk away from that. Not worry about that. Um, but we should pick and choose places. And what we've done thus far is to do an awful lot of surrendering rather than sort of scoping out places where I think that we could make a big difference. You know, one of the great advantages of the Peace Corps has always been that pound for pound, we've been able to supply teachers that are better than virtually any other teachers that go to the Pacific Islands. They're cost effective, highly motivated teachers who are remembered for years afterwards. You know, go to any Pacific Islander who has had a Peace Corps teacher and they will tell you about it. Even in their old age, they will remember those Peace Corps teachers. So, you know, that's something the Chinese can't do. Another thing the Chinese can't do is human mobility. We can actually offer access to Pacific Islanders to come to the United States, and most Pacific Islanders are at least familiar with English. They may not speak it, but at least familiar. But certainly familiar with many of our cultural forms. For instance, the churches and the community halls that you find here in the United States, just not found in the PRC. That's something that we should embrace. One thing I think that I was really encouraged to see the Trump administration doing was providing funding for airfields. And the United States does magnificent work when it comes to air travel. That is small fields, you know, for island hopping planes right up to large planes. And there is an effort being made to try to provide funding to improve airfields across the Pacific. I don't know how quickly it will happen. I don't know how much we can actually do, but it's a place of development that we ought to really pursue.
I think that comprehensive overview of U.S. policy options is the perfect place to stop. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your insights with us, Alan.
It's been terrific, Eric, and it's great to see you again. All the best to you.
Thank you for tuning into this episode. We hope you join us in tracking emerging events across the Asia Pacific and join us for our next episode of Asia Unlocked.